Okay, thanks, Christy. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is...
Sorry, Mike, just to interrupt, would you be able to try the other PowerPoint? We
sorry.
see half of it.
Okay, let me try that. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. As you'll be aware, CIEEM has published revised guidelines on preliminary ecological appraisal. They were published at the back end of last year, and this is an opportunity for me, on behalf of CIEEM and the others involved in producing the document, to take you through some of the key changes to the guidelines, to give you a brief bit of information on the process that we've gone through in updating the guidelines, and also I want to take the opportunity to explain a little bit about why we've taken the step of updating these guidelines. So the fundamental reasons, key reasons for updating the guidelines, first of all, we're aware that there are some areas of confusion, perhaps, stemming from the original guidance published in 2012 that we wanted to try and iron out. In particular, there's certainly confusion out there we're aware of over what actually is a preliminary ecological appraisal. What does that term actually mean? And so we wanted to take the step of giving some clarity over that. We also wanted to explain a bit more, clarify a bit more about where preliminary ecological appraisal fits in the planning process, and in particular to answer this question, which seems to come up regularly, which is, can a preliminary ecological appraisal be submitted to accompany a planning application? The 2012, the original version of the guidelines, suggested that it could be for a small-scale project, and we wanted to add a little bit more detail in relation to that, and I'll come on to that later on. We also wanted to obviously update the document in terms of current policy and legislation that's of relevance. Perhaps ironically, having published the document in December last year, I think it was, it had taken so long to get to that point that we failed to note that the Conservation of Habitats and Species regulations were updated in November of last year. So apologies for those of you who have a version of the document with the wrong reference to those regulations. It either has been corrected or will be corrected imminently. Thank you to the sharp-eyed CIEEM member that spotted our deliberate mistake. It makes no material difference to the document itself. We also wanted to ensure that the guidelines had full geographical applicability. What I mean by that is, I think the guidelines previously, and certainly was true of the previous version of the ECIA guidelines as well, quite English-centric in the way that they approached this process, and the process is obviously applicable to the whole of UK and Ireland with slight differences, but also beyond that as well. So we've taken the step of trying to ensure that this document is applicable throughout the UK and Ireland, and also to overseas territories as well. And finally, we wanted to align the document with those other guidance documents. I just mentioned the ECIA guidelines, which have been updated recently. We've also updated the report writing guidelines. That was done a year or so ago. So we wanted to make sure that it was aligned properly with those other CIEEM guidance documents. The process of the update was undertaken by a working group. The names of the individuals that form that working group are there for you. That was set up, well, April 2015, which gives you an indication of how long it's taken to get to this point. The working group produced drafts which were discussed and reviewed with the Professional Standards Committee throughout the back end of 2015 and throughout 2016. And last year, we were very grateful to Jess both for her efforts in editing the document as a fresh pair of eyes, and also to some key members of the Scottish, Welsh and Irish sections for their input as well. The overseas territories were represented by David Smith on the working group itself. And then in the back end of last year, the draft was approved by the Professional Standards Committee and the Governing Board, and that led to the publication in December. I want to run a quick poll now, if I may. I want to ask you a question just to see what usage there is, and I recognise this is probably a fairly biased group in regard to this on this webinar, but be grateful for your thoughts on whether you or your company undertakes preliminary ecological appraisals as a standard initial step for any development project. So I realise there are a myriad of possible answers to that question, but if you could have a look at which one of these possible answers your approach most closely aligns with. Is the answer yes? For virtually all development projects, you start off with a PEA. Never or very rarely. You only do PEAs for large development projects, or you only do PEAs for small development projects. So those are the four possible answers. So I'll hand you over to Christy to launch the poll.
Great, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I will just launch the poll now. So we'll give you about 10 seconds to make your choice. Okay, so a couple more seconds. And I'll end the poll. So yeah, I'll just share the results with you all.
Okay, that's very interesting. So not unanimous, but a fairly overwhelming answer of yes. It's the initial step for virtually all development projects, which is good. Obviously, there are a few others assigned to the other categories as well, but I'm very encouraged by that response. Excellent, thank you very much for that. So I just want to take you on to some of the key changes that are there in this revision of the guidance. The first one is about how we define preliminary ecological appraisal, and there's certainly aware from certainly from a previous webinar that I was involved with, run by CIEEM and IEMA on ecological impact assessment, with a poll we ran there, that there's pretty much a 50-50 split amongst a lot of the industry over whether PEA is a process or it's a report, an output of a process. We felt, the working group felt, there needed to be clarity over that. We need to come down on one side or the other, and we've taken the step of defining PEA as a process. It's not about the output. The term PEA relates to the process, and that process normally involves a desk study and an extended phase 1 habitat survey. And the guidance document in section 2 defines what it thinks is an appropriate scope for a desk study, as far as it can, in the fact that it's got to be applicable to such a wide geographical area. And it also defines what it thinks should be the scope of an extended phase 1 habitat survey. Extended phase 1 habitat survey in itself is a difficult thing to define. You can ask a lot of different ecologists what is actually an extended phase 1 habitat survey, and they might all give you a different answer. So we're clear in the guidelines, I hope, that what we mean by that is classifying and mapping habitats according to phase 1 habitat coding, plus collecting additional information on habitats to allow them to be, as far as possible, assigned to determine whether they're habitats of particular importance, whether they're local BAP or they're habitats of principal importance for conservation of biodiversity, additional information on their management and their condition, probably on their dominant plant species, and then also additional information on the likely presence of protected or priority species. That's also information that should be collected as part of an extended phase 1 habitat survey. And importantly, and we deal with this particularly in the report writing guidelines, it's important that when we write reports and we in our methods section we say that we've done an extended phase 1 habitat survey, we should be very specific about what are the different elements, what were the different elements of that survey. So if we did a detailed assessment of the hedgerows in terms of their suitability for dormice, we should be saying that in our methods section. So extended phase one habitat survey shouldn't be a, well, we just went out on site, we recorded the habitats and we recorded other stuff that occurred to us at the time. It should be a specific list of things that we set out on site to look for based on our desk study, based on our understanding of a review of aerial photos and ordnance survey maps, and our understanding of the likely local distribution of certain species. So it should be a very specific thing, and obviously that will vary in different parts of the UK and Ireland, and obviously in different parts of the world as well. So we can't be specific, we can't say exactly what must be included in that. That will be site specific, but it's important that when you write reports, you are clear about that. And when you undertake the survey, you're clear about that. Okay, so that's the process. In terms of the outputs of a preliminary ecological appraisal process, the output, it could well be part of an ECIA. That's often an output for the information, or it could be used to scope an ECIA. So you might undertake the preliminary ecological appraisal, identify what additional information is needed in order to produce an ecological impact assessment, and produce a scoping report or undertake a scoping process on the basis of that information. You may, of course, and almost certainly you will, when you come to write the ecological impact assessment, you will include the information gathered as part of the PEA process, the desk study results, the extended phase one habitat survey results, into the baseline information. That is part of your baseline for the ecological impact assessment, although, of course, in most cases, it will be added to with additional survey data. Another output of a PEA is this one, a report to a client or a design team setting out the ecological constraints and opportunities associated with a particular development proposal or with a particular site that might come forward for any given development. So that's what we normally, certainly what I think the previous version of the guidelines pointed us towards as being the output of the PEA. So if you were doing a preliminary ecological appraisal, you produce this report. And a fundamental point being made in this revision is it's not the only possible output of a PEA. You don't have to produce this report. Of course, in a lot of circumstances, it's an important thing to do. It's very useful for the client, and particularly where lots of additional surveys are required, it helps you set out that information so it's clear, it's clearly communicated to the client. We have in box 3 in the guidelines, we've set out what we think are the appropriate content of that sort of report. And there are a number of other reports which you could produce. You could use the PEA process to inform, you could use it to inform management plans, you could use it to inform strategic environmental assessment, lots of other different uses for that process. And the point here, as I just made, is that you can produce lots of different outputs based on the information collected as part of the process. So typical contents of a preliminary ecological appraisal report, that one that I just talked about as setting out constraints and opportunities for the client, which we're calling a PEAR, in an attempt to distinguish between when we're talking about process and when we're talking about report. So the typical contents of this report would obviously include the baseline information that's been collected as part of the PEA process. So that will relate to designated sites, it will relate to habitats, and to an extent, it will relate to protected and priority species as far as information is able to be gathered, because obviously you might be needing to do additional surveys. Okay, so that will to an extent form the baseline, but there will be clear gaps in it in the majority of cases. And on the basis of the information you've got and making relevant assumptions, you would, in a PEAR, you would identify any ecological constraints to the development, and you would be advising the developer, their design team, on how they might amend the scheme design to take account of those, to avoid or minimise what would otherwise be significant ecological effects. You would also identify the likely mitigation measures that would be required, even beyond changes to scheme design. And then obviously where scheme design you're proposing that changes, those mitigation measures aren't at this stage completely defined. They are options. and also the potential licensing and timing constraints, so that the developer is fully informed about the implications of dealing with ecology in terms of their project budget and their project program. You'd also expect to have a list of the further surveys necessary to inform an ecological impact assessment. So if the output of your PEA, having assessed the information you've got, is to identify gaps that further surveys are needed for breeding birds and foraging bats and badgers or great-crested newts, whatever it is, you've got a list of further surveys, and probably go a step further and say you should be also defining which parts of the site those surveys are needed in, and the methodologies or methods that should be used, and any timing issues associated with those surveys. And you would also expect that you'd identify the opportunities for enhancement in APEAR as well, so areas where developers are able to deliver some sort of biodiversity gain. So on the basis of that description of a preliminary ecological appraisal report, the question I've got for you in the next poll is, do you or your company, do you regularly submit preliminary ecological appraisal reports to local authorities to accompany planning applications? And when I say, do you submit, I accept that in the vast majority of cases it's your client or your planning consultant that does the actual submission, but you're aware that your report is being used for that purpose. Okay, so do you regularly submit or have submitted on your behalf PEARs to local authorities to accompany planning applications? Is the answer that most closely fits? Yes, for virtually all development projects. Only for small development projects, because you'd produce an ECIA report for large developments. Is the answer yes? We do regularly submit those reports, but only if they're accompanied by other reports that then deal with the outcomes of the recommended surveys. So the PEAR goes in as part of a bundle of information. It's accompanied by the Great Crested Newt Survey report, the Breeding Bird Survey report, everything else. Is the answer that most closely fits? Only for projects where there are no further surveys needed and the mitigation is clear and straightforward? Or is the answer no, we don't submit regularly PEARs to local authorities to accompany planning applications because that report is only circulated to the client and within the design team. It's not intended for the local authority. Okay, so that's the question. Those are the possible answers. As I say, pick the one that's closest to what you think is your standard practice, and I'll hand over to Christy to run the poll.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'll just launch the poll again. And we'll give you about 10 seconds just to make your choice. Okay, I'll end the poll now and share the results with you all.
Okay, that's an interesting spread of answers, which I'm slightly surprised. Well, maybe I'm not surprised by. I'm just going to run through those whilst those results are up there. So if we just leave those up for the time being, what I would say is that there certainly are. I'm aware there are different approaches in different companies to how they use preliminary ecological appraisal reports. The approach, I would say, or the approaches that most closely align with the Professional Standards Committee's view of how PEARs should be used, and I believe also ALGI's view as well, certainly the individuals in ALGI that I speak to, are probably the final two on that list. So if you were to answer, no, we don't submit PEARs to the local authority, they only go to the client and the design team, then I would say that is certainly an acceptable answer to this question. There may be a set of circumstances in which you do, but in the majority of cases, it's treated as a separate document to anything that goes to the local authority. That, I would say, ticks the box as far as what we see as the right answer is. The next one up, only for projects where there are no further surveys needed and the mitigation is clear and straightforward. I would say that's also an acceptable answer to this question. and would align well with how the guidelines are written and how they're intended. And I'll come on to that a bit more later on. So if you answered numbers 4 or 5 on the list, then that's good. The middle one, the one that's actually got the most answers, or the most responses, yes, you submit PEARs, but only if accompanied by other reports dealing with the recommended surveys. As far as the planning authority are concerned, and in them exercising their duties in considering a planning application, that probably is an acceptable answer. That they probably are being given there all the information they need, because you're not giving them the PEAR that recommends a load of additional surveys without that additional information. So essentially that bundle it should allow them to perform their role in considering the planning application. So in that sense, that is also an acceptable answer to this question. However, the reason I would see that as less favourable as a standard practice, and I accept that there are circumstances in which you may well do that, but the reason we'd see it as less favourable is that dependent on the scenario, that can make things quite difficult for the planning authority and anybody else trying to review the overall outcomes of a project, of a development project for wildlife, for biodiversity. It can make that role quite difficult depending on how complex the project is. So if you've done a PEAR and you're able to deal with all the mitigation needed and all the design issues and everything's straightforward, except there's a pond off-site and it could have great crested newts in it, and if there are, then the suitable terrestrial habitat on your site for great crested newts, and that's the only issue. If you then go along and do your great crested newt survey and write a report that says there are no great crested newts present, therefore this is not material to the assessment, and actually everything that was written in the PEAR stands, then submitting those two reports together, I would say that is perfectly fine. The local authority, their ecologist, the person that does that role for them reviewing those reports, should be able to piece together the information pretty easily with those two reports. So in that case, the bundle of information is fine. In scenarios where actually the outcome of the additional surveys that were recommended are to find a species which has is a material consideration and changes the assessment that's presented in the PEAR, you then end up with two documents that sit next to each other, each dealing with assessment and working out which one overrides the other and what the overall outcomes are can be quite difficult unless that second document is very tightly written. So that's where it starts to become a problem. And the more surveys you add, the more difficult that is for the planning authority. So where you've got a PEAR plus a great crested newt survey report, plus a bat activity survey report, plus a breeding bird survey report, plus everything else, all with different recommendations, all with different bits of mitigation, actually I think what you need is an overarching document that brings all of that together. So if you answered yes to that middle one, you go with the bundle of information normally. I'd give some thought as to whether that's helping the local authority perform their role, or whether actually you should be only doing that in specific circumstances where producing an overarching document would be massively disproportionate with the implications for the scheme, and actually is pretty clear and straightforward. The next one up, only for small development projects. That's certainly what the previous version of the guidelines sort of alluded to. The problem that I have with that is there isn't really a good definition of what's a small project and what's a large development project, certainly not one that's got wide-scale agreement. So the scale of the size of the project is often irrelevant in terms of whether how much mitigation you need or whether you need further surveys. It's often more about what the potential impacts are. Admittedly, small-scale projects are more likely to fall under the fourth category on here, that no further surveys are needed and mitigation is clear and straightforward, but it's not always the case. And yes, so if you answered yes to number 2, then I'd just have a look at the circumstances in which you think that's appropriate, and maybe consider whether you need to vary that. And if you answered yes to the top one, then that's certainly not what we would think of as being appropriate. In the vast majority of cases, PEARs shouldn't be submitted in the absence of any other information, as I've gone through. Okay, thank you very much for that. Hopefully that's useful. Just to run us on then, it sort of runs us in nicely into where preliminary ecological appraisal sits in relation to planning applications. And this is, I think, is the point we've just been talking about. In general, in most circumstances, a preliminary ecological appraisal report is not appropriate to accompany a planning application. And the reason for that is that it normally includes recommendations. It normally includes recommendations for how the developer might change scheme design. It gives them options. It might include possible options for mitigation dependent on design-ish options that are taken, or dependent on the outcomes of further surveys, and includes those recommendations for further surveys in most cases. So for that's the reason why we would normally say you should not be submitting a PEAR to accompany a planning application. Essentially, what that document, if you look at the report writing guidelines on PEARs, normally that document is written to tell the client what they should be doing. It isn't written normally to tell the local authority what the client is going to do. Okay, that is what we would consider to be an ECIA. So an ECIA report, we would say, has all the information needed to make a judgment on significance of effects. It explains what the client is intending to deliver in terms of the design of the scheme. It explains what the client is intending to deliver in terms of mitigation, and there are no further surveys needed, and any unknowns are dealt with in terms of assessment in both directions. So if it's an outline application, you're not sure whether a particular hedgerow is going to stay or come out, you can assess both options. Okay, a PEA report, a PEAR, normally telling the client these are the things you should be thinking about. These are the things that are implications for your budget and program, and that's the fundamental difference. However, it is possible to produce an ecological impact assessment report for a very simple, straightforward site on the basis of a PEA alone. So on the basis of that process, the Death Study and Extended Phase 1 Habitat Survey, if no further surveys are needed, you can still write an ECIA report. You're not required to set out your answers in a PEAR if the purpose of the report is to tell the planning authority what the implications of the scheme are, given that the client has committed to mitigation measures and a specific design. And that's that point. I'll just go back to that. That's an important point for. I don't know who's on this webinar, whether this is predominantly consultants, whether there are local authority ecologists on this webinar as well. But that confusion about being able to write an ECIA based purely on a Death Study and Extended Phase 1 Habitat Survey certainly exists, in my experience, amongst local authority ecologists as well as amongst consultants. So it's important that that everybody has the same understanding of this. Otherwise, obviously, we'll get into difficulties. A PEAR can be submitted as an appendix to an ECIA. So you can write an ecological impact assessment as a covering document. Appended to it could be your PEAR and your Great Crescent New Survey report and your Breeding Bird Survey report and everything else. That's a perfectly acceptable way of submitting the information and using your preliminary ecological appraisal report. The pitfall with that to look out for is that you, at the time that you write the preliminary ecological appraisal report, the recommendations you make, things might change, might move on at the point that you write the ECIA report. And if you've got a disparity between something that was recommended in the PEAR, maybe a further survey you thought might be needed at the time, or some design changes you thought would be good, if something's changed and justifiably those surveys haven't been done or those design changes haven't been made, and there's a perfectly good reason for that, then you will need, I would say, in the ECIA report to pick that up and make sure that disparity is aired and dealt with. And that's one of the problems with incorporating the whole preliminary ecological appraisal report as an appendix to an ECIA, that you can get these disparities, of course. That you could say that could be helpful if there is no justification for that disparity, but it's something to look out for. Preliminary ecological appraisal reports can be submitted where they're accompanied by the other necessary ecological survey reports, and we talked about that bundle of information, and we've already talked about the reasons why that's acceptable, but is less favoured because it makes the planning authority's job more difficult for them. Or you can submit the PEAR on its own to accompany a planning application in circumstances where no further surveys are needed. There's nothing else to recommend. There is enough information available and is incorporated into that document, reported in that document in relation to the design of the scheme to make a sufficiently robust assessment of the ecological effects. And there's enough information in the document that's presented on mitigation and enhancement measures to allow the local authority certainty about delivery of those measures. So the client's committed to them. They are feasible, they are either incorporated onto the design drawings, or they are securable in some other way by a planning condition or a planning obligation. Okay, so in those circumstances where all of those three factors fit a particular situation, then you could just submit the PEA report on its own, because it effectively is doing the job of an ECIA report. Personally, if I find myself in this situation, I just write an ECIA report, because I think actually it's not going to cost me any more. I'd agree that with the client first and manage the client's expectations, but I think that's doing more of a favour for the client, putting them in a clearer position, and it's helping the local authority as well. Of course, we wouldn't do that if that could mask certain issues. That's only where it's clear and it's appropriate to do so. And paragraphs 314 and 315 of the PEA, the revised guidelines, deal with this issue. So if you find yourself in a scenario and you're meeting resistance from a local authority or whoever else to the fact that you've submitted this report, then there are paragraphs there that you can refer them to that as far as CIEEM is concerned, this scenario, it is appropriate. Okay, but in all of the scenarios, we'd say in general, you shouldn't be submitting a PEAR to a local authority as part of a planning application. Some other things that are covered in the guidance, those are the main issues I wanted to deal with. Some other issues that are covered. First of all, we regularly use terms about such as protected and priority species, priority habitats, species of conservation concern. Lots of different terms are used to basically cover species or habitats that we care about in terms of an ECIA and that we're going to cover in our assessment. We've decided in pulling together the revised guidelines that we will use the term priority species, so protected and priority species, so that it includes other things like badgers, for example. And we've gone to the extent of defining what we mean by that. So there's a fairly wide definition. So in England, that's your species of principal importance. It's whatever the local biodiversity action plan species are. It might include red list bird species, nationally notable invertebrates. So box one sets out what it thinks are appropriate sources of information to use when basically setting out as to these are the protected and priority species and indeed priority habitats that you need to be dealing with. So the idea is to promote consistency of terminology and consistency in the scope of assessments that people are undertaking. The term priority species, there isn't really a good term for that. Lots of different terms are used, and priority species is used in the MPPF. It harks back a little bit to the old UK Biodiversity Action Plan, and it's got another meaning in terms of the habitats regulation. So it's a difficult term, but we felt it was the best term. But in the context of a PEA, the term priority species is defined for you in box one as to what we think we mean by that. Also, in the guidance, we've covered scenarios in which further surveys are not, we think, are not required at the stage of submitting a planning application. This is an issue we think we wanted to cover this because quite often with preliminary ecological appraisals, particularly when people are producing preliminary ecological appraisal reports, further surveys are being recommended, and clearly there is government guidance out there that tells local authorities that all surveys needed to allow them to determine whether there's significant effect or not, to allow them to discharge their duties, need to be completed before the application is determined, and for planning authorities that generally means before it's submitted. Often they won't validate the application until that information has been provided. However, we think there are certain scenarios, perhaps quite limited scenarios, but there are scenarios nevertheless in which surveys can be legitimately undertaken post-consent and still accord with the government guidance. So I refer you to box 4 in the guidance, which hopefully sets out those sort of scenarios. So it talks about scenarios such as where survey information perhaps needs to be updated, and there are fundamental reasons why that can't be done, such as for a phased development over 10, 20 years. It would be appropriate to do another survey to update prior to phase 2 commencing, for example. That's a perfectly, obviously a perfectly acceptable situation in which a further survey can be undertaken post-consent. In essence, it has to be. There are a number of other scenarios, for example, where there's enough information to determine no significant effect for the planning authority to make that judgment, but a survey is probably needed to inform the fine detail of a licence application. There are obviously issues there with planning authorities giving enough consideration to whether an application, a licence is likely to be granted or not. But in a lot of cases, there are scenarios that they can do their part of the assessment without some of the surveys that licensing bodies might want prior to the license being issued. Okay, so then those are other situations in which perhaps surveys can follow on post-consent. So that is, there are grey areas within that. There's no hard and fast answers. So hopefully, to try and explain some of those grey areas, we've set out 3 examples in Appendix 5, which set out scenarios where further surveys are or are not necessary to inform an ECIA. So there's an A and B scenario against each of those 1 to 3, which explains in this situation, you're on this side of the line, and therefore you probably need that survey pre-consent. In this situation, you're the other side of the line, and you're probably okay doing that post-consent. Hopefully that's helpful. We've also provided a flowchart, which in Appendix 1, which hopefully explains how preliminary ecological appraisal fits into the planning process and the outputs that we expect from it. And it looks a bit like this, and I don't know how well you can see that on your screens. It's in the obviously in the guidance. Just to take you through this is hopefully fairly obvious, but the green boxes, they deal with the process of preliminary ecological appraisal, and then you've got sort of the blue and white row, which deals with further surveys and design information, and the red box at the end are the possible outputs. So just running from, I won't take you through the green boxes because hopefully they're all fairly straightforward, but having undertaken the process of PEA, your options are going down the left-hand side of the flowchart. No further surveys are needed. You've got enough design information. You can draw a conclusion of no significant effects. The mitigation can be detailed. Then what the box below that should say is it should say you should produce an ECIA report that is proportionate to the project. So it doesn't need to be pages and pages of information because it's an ECIA report. It just needs to be enough for a really simple, straightforward site to deal with the issues that the planning authority need to consider. What it actually says is produce a low impact ECIA report, and it was certainly our intention when we set out producing this document that we would have developed a specific template for low impact ECIA reports, something we're working on with Albi at the moment. We haven't yet got there, so that box will be changed, and it will say produce a proportionate ECIA report. And that is the circumstance as well, where we talked about you could also simply submit a PEAR report that's written in the right way. But our preference would be a relatively brief ECIA report. The middle column, where it says for large or complex projects, or whether there's a time lag between producing the PEA and the ECIA, or indeed where your client wants it, produce a preliminary ecological appraisal report that sets out constraints and opportunities, what further surveys are needed, all that stuff we've talked about. That report, because of the way it's going to be written, is not normally appropriate to submit to accompany the planning application. I apologise, the word support is used regularly in these boxes, but planning applications, what we should say is accompany, because clearly it's not a biased report. It's one that sets out the implications rather than being in support or otherwise. And from that box, you can, of course, obviously then go up and undertake further surveys that gives you enough information and get the information about the scheme, and from that produce an ECIA report, which might be based on your PEA report, but the back end of the document, the bit that talks about constraints and opportunities and the further surveys, is exchanged for an assessment of ecological effects and proposed mitigation measures. Or alternatively, you could come down the whole of the right-hand side of this flowchart. So if you come down the right-hand side from the green boxes, for simple projects where there's really no delay between producing the PEA and producing an ECIA, and where you can communicate the outcomes that you would have put into a PA report very simply to your client in an email, you can perhaps, rather than producing a PA report, just undertake the further surveys needed and put all the information into the ECIA report. And hopefully that saves the client some cost in doing that. Of course, that's about how you manage the issues of dealing with your clients and what they want to see as well. Just finally, to end then, I just want to draw your attention to the guidelines for ecological report writing, which I've already mentioned, and also this webpage, which was added to the CIEEM website, I think about the same time that the PA guidelines were published, which is a guide to ecological surveys and their purpose. The intention of this webpage is to try and define some of these terms, to define terms like preliminary ecological appraisal, preliminary ecological appraisal report, and extended phase one habitat survey, and all those other things. And hopefully, if I can make the technology work, hopefully you can see that webpage now. And I suggest you take a look at this when you get a chance. Hopefully it will prove useful to you. It will prove useful in both in making sure you're following the approach that your interpretation of CIEEM's guidelines is correct, and also if you are struggling with a local authority ecologist, or you're struggling with a client in not having the same understanding as you, then hopefully this provides a common ground. Of course, you might be the local authority ecologist struggling with a consultant, and this is there for everyone to use and to form a common source of information. I've just highlighted the paragraphs here about you can produce a PEA in a PEA report, or simply incorporate the outcomes of the PEA into an ECIA. So you don't need to produce the PEA report. And also a PEA report does not replace an ECIA report because of this issue about normally includes recommendations. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover. So I'll hand you back to Christy, and we'll see if anyone has any questions on any of that.
Great, thank you, Mike. That's great. So before we start the Q&A, if I just show everybody how to record this webinar in your CPD tool. So it will be using the competencies A4 and SM3, and yeah, it will be structured CPD, CIEEM webinar, and using those two competencies. So yeah, we've had a few questions already, so I will read them out and Mike will endeavour to answer them. So we have a question from Jenny. App 1 refers to low impact ECIA guidance being set out in the report writing guidelines.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Chrissy. I think I think probably Jenny sent that one in before, hopefully before I just covered that last point on one of the final slides. So I think
okay.
I've dealt with that one already.
No problem. Okay, so Rhiannon said, in my mind, a pair is just an updated version of an extended phase 1 habitat report. Do you see any significant difference between the two?
So I guess a pair is, we would normally expect to include the outcomes of an extended phase 1 habitat survey and a desk study, and to explain the implications of that in the context of a specific development project. So it depends what you mean by an extended phase 1 habitat report, because again, that's not a defined thing. You could argue that if I go out and do an extended phase 1 habitat survey and I just write a report that explains my methods and my results, and that's it, stops at that point, that is an extended phase 1 habitat survey report. In my mind, it might mean something different to you, but that might be what it means to me. So the PEAR, yes, when you do an extended phase 1 habitat survey report, you include desk study information and you explain the implications for the client in terms of what additional information might be needed or how they might change their design, what are the key constraints. Then essentially it is one and the same thing. But I think what we'd really like to see, one of the problems that's dogged ecological report writing over however many years is the fact that there is a lack of consistency in terminology that people are using. So I would encourage you to, if your extended phase 1 habitat survey report is what I've just described and effectively is the same as a PEA report, call it a PEA report. I'm sorry, I don't want to inflict names on titles of reports on people or styles of writing, but it really will help us, I think, get to a point where everyone understands when they look at a document what it is just by reading the front page.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So we've got quite a long one here from Andre. I'm interested to hear the reason for including amber listed bird species as priority species. Medium and large size projects with a certain degree of habitat diversity often contain long lists of amber listed species, including such common and widespread species with often locally stable populations as newt swan, mallard, common sandpiper, snipe, willow marbler, warbler, stable or even increasing in parts of Scotland, dunnock and meadow pipit. Including such species appears to stand in contrast to the principle of proportionality. Does it make sense to highlight these species in a development context and put them on a similar footing as curlew, cuckoo, lesser spotted woodpecker, wood warbler and nightingale?
Okay, that's a very specific question. I think the reason for including them is that there is a defined list of species there that's regularly updated that tells us which species may be declining, and so I think it's appropriate for us to take account of those in producing ECIA reports and therefore in our starting point for our preliminary ecological appraisal. But I absolutely agree that there is a difference between a significant effect on something which is critically endangered and something which is perhaps identified as being on the amber list of birds of conservation concern. So one of the issues with birds is often that in ECIA, people lump birds together as a group and try and assess the impacts of a development on birds. People often do the same thing with bats and other groups as well. And the problem is that you've got a very varied group of different species with different habitat requirements, different likely impacts associated with developments, different risks, and different statuses. And so I think you need to make sure that you are accounting for individual species or groups of similar species with similar status and similar habitat requirements separately. The justification for including them, well, because there is a published list that suggests that they are of some conservation concern.
Okay. Next question. Whilst pairs are supposed supposed to only be submitted to LPAs when no further surveys are needed. Surely it's not really in the ecologist's hand as to whether the client or planning consultant submits them.
I agree to a point. It's certainly possible that once you've submitted a PEAR to a client, they might then just go and submit that. I think you can. I think you can address that to a certain extent, the likelihood of that happening, by being clear with your client what the purpose of that document is. You can be clear when you tender for the work. You can be clear in the introduction of your introduction to your report. You can say what the purpose is. You can also say what the purpose of that report is not. If you feel that it fits the bill, that it's got everything in it necessary to a company planning application, then you can say that in the introduction. If you think that it doesn't, additional information is needed and needs to be added prior to determination of the application, then you can also say that. I realise that certain clients can be can see that as a problem and might disagree with you. But I think as long as you communicate that to the client, if the client then chooses to submit that report against your specific advice, then that becomes the client's problem.
Okay. Next question. The LPAs in Devon and Cornwall ask us consultants for a PEA by name and will not accept one that recommends further surveys. So we are asked to produce a PEA with additional surveys in order to support a planning application.
Okay. So if the local authority are, my interpretation of what you're asking there is that the local authorities are asking you to produce a PEA report and all the other survey reports and submit that bundle of information. If the planning authorities are telling you that's what they want, then by all means do that. I would suggest to the planning authorities that there might be, that if they were to ask for an ECIA report, that they might be might receive something that gives them more clear assessment, but that's up to them. So if a planning authority is specifically asking you for a PEA report and any additional surveys needed to underpin the overall assessment, then by all means carry on doing that.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Emma asks, just out of interest in relation to the polls, how many people are on the webinar? And I can confirm there were 316 altogether. A few have dropped out now, but that was the maximum amount of people attending. So next question, Liz, as a LA ecologist, really welcome these points of clarification and hope the consultants watching take note of the use of PEAs in the planning application process. So many times I see PEARs submitted by unknowing applicants thinking they have ticked the biodiversity box. Most welcomed. So I think that's more of a comment than a question.
Yes, good, thank you, Liz.
Yep. So another one, which I think follows on from the previous with Deirdre, many LPAs don't have a county ecologist, and therefore the officers handling the ecology do not understand the differences between Phase 1 habitat surveys, PEAs and ECIA. They just want to know that you have followed the guidelines, identified the habitats and made an assessment as to whether protected habitats or species will be negatively impacted upon. Also, enhancements usually given in an ECOP. Okay.
Yes, there are a number of local authorities that don't have an ecologist or access to one. That's a difficult one for CIEEM to deal with. We obviously want to encourage our members to produce reports which do the job that the local authorities need, and so the better we can make our reports as CIEEM members, obviously the more helpful that is in that scenario. There are situations in which local authorities then, in the absence of a local authority ecologist, are not asking for the right information. They might ask for a Phase 1 habitat survey or an ecology survey and not be very specific. And so yes, I agree that in some cases, particularly where you haven't got a local authority ecologist, there's a lack of understanding of the differences between these different survey types and reports. that's where hopefully the web page that I just referred you to will help you. You might be, if you're getting from a client a request for something from the local authority and you think it's wrong, you can make reference to that web page. We're also working at the moment with Simon, working with Algae, to try to produce a checklist for an ECIA, so that the local authority can, ideally they have a local authority ecologist to do this, but they can actually see what are the much more specific questions that should be answered that go beyond the sort of summary that you've given here, which hopefully will help also those authorities that don't have a local authority ecologist, A, to see where the information they've got is acceptable or not, and B, perhaps also to realise that they need to employ a local authority ecologist.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Just to note, we only have a few minutes left. Are there any questions that you would like to answer in this webinar? Are you happy to answer questions outside of the webinar?
Yes, if you want to set up a LinkedIn.
Yeah, that would be fine. Sorry, I think Heather has a couple that she'd really like answering. Would you mind?
No, of course.
Answering them? So Heather said, interesting to note that you recommended an ECIA as best practice for even small schemes. It's my understanding that ECIA should include, as standard, information relating to cumulative impacts, as would be expected under an ECIA that would accompany an EIA report. How would this be applied to small developments? I have not seen this and would not expect this when reviewing applications on behalf of LPAs.
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. So the short answer is yes, an ECIA report should give consideration to cumulative potential for significant cumulative effects. For very small scale projects, it would be a very specific set of circumstances where you might expect that project to give rise to a significant cumulative effect. And so I think that should be dealt with in an ECIA report for a small scale project in a proportionate manner. It is if you've got a development directly adjacent and it's affecting the same feature as or species or habitat as you're dealing with, then I think it is appropriate to consider cumulative effects. And but the scope of that, I would expect, by nature of the fact that the development is small, would be a much smaller, there'd be a smaller zone of influence, a smaller scope to the cumulative effects assessment than you would get for a large development.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think, yeah, our time's up now, I'm afraid. We do still have quite a few questions that need answering, so I will set up a LinkedIn post on CIEEM's group. So if you'd like to post your questions in there, we will be sending out a feedback survey, so I'll pop the link in there with the feedback survey so you can ask your questions on using that forum. So yeah, we'd just like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope you found it useful. Yeah, we do welcome your feedback to help improve our webinars for the future, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.